Okay. So, welcome everyone. As you all know, I'm Father Carl, and I've really been looking forward to this Sunday and next. There's been some very preliminary work happening over the last year or so. A couple of people, Alexis, myself, Christina Schoenfeld, Marguerite LeBron, Mother Lindsay, we've, in the midst of the pandemic, moving things around, we've been pulling out old documents, thinking about the history of the church in a new way during this pandemic time. And we're also one of many parishes in the Diocese of Long Island that is engaging in an intentional way with our history as a way of getting some guidance and grounding for our mission going forward. And I'll say more about that in a second, but I want to ground our work today and the project that I hope will unfold over the next year or so in a phrase from a verse of scripture from the prophet Jeremiah, Regan's faith. Stand at the crossroads and look. Ask for the ancient paths. Ask where the good way is and walk in it, and you will find rest for your souls. I'm going to read that just one more time to let it all sink in for us. Stand at the crossroads and look. Ask for the ancient paths. Ask where the good way is and walk in it, and you will find rest for your souls. With these other churches in the diocese, and I think in the broader Episcopal Church, there's a sense that we are standing at a kind of crossroads. The crossroads of this stage of the pandemic. The crossroads in our ongoing reckoning with systemic racism as a nation. We've been shaken out of our familiar habits and practices, and we're asking, what is the way forward? What is the life-giving way? What is the good way? And what does it mean for us to walk in it? And when I think of turning to the ancient ways, of course, that means something here, the ancient ways of this community of Zion, almost 200 years old. But it also means the ancient ways going back to the people of Israel, seeking God's presence in the wilderness, knowing God's presence, liberating them from slavery, walking in the good way, the ancient way of Jesus and the first disciples and the early church. How do we connect up to that good way? What are the parts of our own local history that feel really aligned with that and we want to celebrate? And what might be some of the parts of our history, of our legacy, of our present practice that have come out of alignment with that? And as Mother Lindsay said in her sermon, might be things that we need to let go of before we can follow Jesus into this next chapter. So this Zion History Project is, again, asking how this broad and complicated and beautiful legacy might shape our mission, how our past can guide us in the present and in the future. One of the questions, again, is about what are all the wonderful parts of our history, and how can the gifts of our legacy shape and sustain our call today and tomorrow? Just one quick example. I think many of us have heard this wonderful story that's come down to us of the day that the timbers framing the original church were raised in 1830. There was a group of neighbors who got together and they put up this frame. And at the end of the day of that hard work, they all sat down to a feast at one long table that stretched 2 blocks down what is now Northern Boulevard. I love that image of people coming together in shared purpose and then feasting together at one common table. So how might that gift of our legacy shape our response to shifting patterns of food insecurity in Douglaston, Little Neck in the fall of 2021 going forward? Or how might that wonderful story shape the way we engage with new neighbors moving into the shelter across the street in the spring? What might we be called to build with them? And how might we celebrate together as at one common table? That's just one example of how a gift of our past might shape the way that we think about the present and the future. So again, we have much to be proud of, many gifts. But even in just this preliminary research that we've done, we've discovered that there are some wounds in our history, some tough things that we might need to confront. And those too can be a guide to our action as we step into the next chapter of our life together. How might those wounds be calling us to seek healing and reconciliation? And I think it's really important to say this, that we can tell the tough parts of this history as we learn about it, because we trust Jesus when he tells us that the truth will set us free. This whole history project that we're doing, like everything else that we do here at Zion, is seeking to be guided by the gospel, seeking to be guided by the core tenets of our faith. And that's really important to say, because I'm sure I don't need to tell all of you that we are living in a period of time in our nation's history when conversations about history seem to be guided by really loud voices that are not talking about the gospel. On the one hand, we have really loud voices that are interested in simplifying and whitewashing a path, sticking with myths that no longer serve us. On the other hand, we have people who are relating to the past through a lens of shame, who seek to cancel anyone who has sinned. And I think, thinking about our own tradition, people who have erred include the entire nation of Israel, all the disciples, the Apostle Paul, all of our spiritual ancestors could be canceled. And yet they attempted to stay faithful, and that's our task as well. So we are not whitewashing the past. We're not seeking to cancel anyone. We are asking these questions about the truth of our history in light of the good news that we are all of us sinners, and that God delights in reconciling with us. God never cancels anyone, because God's forgiving grace is overflowing. There's so much we want to learn, and I just want to say this very clearly. There's nothing we can learn that will change God's love for us. But embracing our history, good and the bad, the gifts and the wounds, might empower us to step more fully into our mission to be Christ's hands and heart in this world. So I'm going to invite Alexis to come up in just a second. Today's presentation is about one track, one stream of research that we've begun and want to continue over the next year. And that's about the Matinecock people here at Zion in our history, and Zion's legacy on Matinecock land. Next Sunday, we are going to talk about, again, our preliminary findings as it relates to the presence and absence of Black Americans in Zion's history. I'm going to repeat this at the end, but there's so much more that we want to learn, and I'm inviting each of you to participate in that learning in whatever way you feel led. If you want to get into the archival documents, to pour through the vestry minutes, to go to the New York Public Library archives, that would be amazing. If you would like to be a part of an intentional conversation that happens regularly about what we're learning and how that feels and what that means for your sense of Zion's mission, that's also absolutely central to this thing. So all of this is just we're saying a few things that we do know and trying to honor so much that we don't yet know and want to learn. And I'm inviting all of you into that learning together. So without further ado, Alexis, will you kick us off? Tell us a little bit about Zion's historic connections with the area's indigenous community.
Yeah, so thank you, Father Carl. Thank you, everyone, for coming this afternoon. So as many of you may or may not be aware, Zion has deep historic connections with our area's indigenous community. This is a picture of the Matinecock Memorial that's in our graveyard, circa 1964. If you haven't visited the memorial, I think that you absolutely should. It's just around the corner. If anybody needs, well, around the corner that way. And if anybody needs a tour, I will happily escort you either after this or any other time. But the words on the writing are, "Here rest the last of the Matinecocks." And I think that it's really important for everyone in our community to know that the Matinecock community as it exists today finds those words deeply hurtful, in that it somehow implies, or was meant to imply when it was record, that somehow the Matinecock are gone and no longer with us, and that their culture and legacy do not exist today. And that is not the case. As many of you may or may not know, there's a reservation of Shinnecock Indians out on Long Island, and a lot of those indigenous folks can trace their roots back to the indigenous community that was part of Zion, and that they continue to exist. Now, this memorial has a context in that the Waters family had a burial ground that was on Northern Boulevard, right around where the bank is in the old Ace Hardware store, that stretch of Northern Boulevard. And that was their family burial ground where Matinecocks, as well as their ancestors, were buried. And in the 1920s, the city wanted to widen Northern Boulevard. And, you know, there was a sense that this is what the community needed for progress. And James Waters of the Waters family fought very hard against that expansion process. He was ultimately unsuccessful. And shortly after he passed away, the city was able to rip up this burial ground. And at the cost, the city bore the cost. They moved the remains, some of the remains, not all of the remains, but some of the remains from the Indian burial ground to the plot on our churchyard. So as a result, this memorial was erected to commemorate that. And we'll talk a little bit more about the context of who did that and when. You know, I'm very proud actually of the fact that this community has kept up the ties with our indigenous members and the indigenous community. And I don't know if you guys may recall, in 2018, we reinterred, with the help of the tribe, some remains that were found in Florida, I believe, right, Motherlands? In Florida, where they could trace the remains in Florida back to that plot on Northern Boulevard. Because when Northern Boulevard expanded, folks came in and they took objects, they took remains. And actually, some of the remains from that plot were also exhibited in a nature room at PS 98 for a while. But, you know, we were able to participate in the ceremony. And as you can see, the grounds around the memorial themselves have recently been renovated. So it's with the help of the Boy Scouts. So this is a picture that if some of you might recall seeing, in that I think when a lot of people think about, you know, this photo's portrayed in the guild room. You know, when you think of what Matinecocks look like in Zion, this is the photo they think about. But I think it's notable to observe that in our guild room, we never had the caption of what the context was and who was actually in the photograph. So we've kind of always just displayed it like this. And I think it's really significant to recognize the importance of this event. So in 1958, the Matinecock tribal nation reconvened its tribal council for the first time in 100 years on our grounds. So that this was a very sacred event for the Matinecock, in that it was a reconstitution of some of the formalities of the tribe that had sort of fallen away over time. So, you know, one of the things that I hope to do in the coming weeks and months is to do more research about the participants in that event and how it connects to the Zion community. All right, so now I just want to do a little experiment. I want you to guys close your eyes and just close your eyes and think about what a member of Zion Church looked like in the 1800s. Clothes they wear, like, how do you envision the members of our community? All right, so open your eyes. And we were very happy. I was very happy to find this picture. And again, this was from the Matinecock tribe's website. But this is a picture of John Waters. He's a member of our community. He was a native Algonquin speaker. And I was just thinking about this, Father Carl. He was probably about 10 years old when the church walls were erected. And to think about the fact that he, like my kid, is running around today, right? He was probably running around that picnic that afternoon where his parents and the folks around him, you know, erected our church. We don't know that for a fact, but it's maybe something we could think about as having happened. John was the son of James Water and Mary Hubb. He had indigenous ancestors on both sides of his family. And I think it's really important that not only we name our members, but just also remember that they have an ancestry and a context and a history that runs both ways, right? Because one of the things I think about when I think about John is that he is an ancestor of Donna Barron, who some of you may know as having done a lot of really wonderful historical research on the subject. And she has books that if any of you are interested in, I can point you to. But that he also had a very deep ancestry of his own, because I think too often Native histories get lost and elided and glossed over. So he's the grandson of Charles Water and Jerusalem, and their marriage ended the hostilities between the Narragansetts and the Montaukets. And he's a descendant of Mary, sister of Massasoit. And Massasoit is one of the tribal leaders that was involved in the first Thanksgiving. So, you know, it's important to kind of think about that the native peoples of this area existed for hundreds, if not thousands of years before Western settlement, and that the Waters family actually came down from Connecticut. So we're going to talk more about that sort of early history and European contact in the community. I'm going to hand it back to Father Carl.
So just to zoom out a little bit and to take us back, does anybody know what the original name of Little Neck was, where that comes from. The original name, the native peoples of this territory called this area Menhadenok, which means place of fish in Algonquin. And when the first white Europeans arrived and laid claim to this land, they adopted that initially and sort of first made it sound sort of more Dutch to them, and then anglicized it, and it became Menhadenok became Madmen's Neck. Madmen's Neck. And the way that the histories come down to us, this is definitely the kind of history that I learned when I was in school, is that when the first Dutch settlers arrived in 1624, and then later the English arrived after them, that there was very little mention of the fact that the land was already occupied and had been for generations and generations and generations. And we have accounts that read like Henry Onderdonk's here, that in 1663, it was agreed by the English governors of New York that Thomas Hicks, John, and Thomas Ellison shall have the Little Neck, or point of land on the east side of Matthew Garrison's Bay, which neck is commonly called Madmen's Neck, in lieu of their dividends on condition they would go forth with and possess and build on it. So they're getting out of some taxes that they would need to pay by occupying this land and developing it. And there's no mention in this account at all of the fact that that land was already occupied and sacred to native people who had been living on it for many, 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 many years. We do know that the native chief Takapusha in the mid-1600s disputed those English land grants, and like James Wild Pigeon Waters many years later fought and fought and fought to say, no, this land is sacred to us. And just like the city of New York said, too bad, in 1663, Thomas Hicks and company, there's also mention of some Cornells and potentially involved in this as well. They lost patience and they waged an armed raid on Takapusha and the other native peoples who were living here. And that came to be known as the Battle of Madmen's Neck. Historians have placed that battle, that armed hostility, at the intersection of what is now Northern Boulevard and Marathon Parkway, where the Stop and Shop is, Marathon Food Mart and McDonald's. So after that display of white colonial military power, many native people did leave the area, frightened for their families by that display of force. But obviously not all of the native people left. The Waters and the Davis families continued to live here. And I think one of the things that I would love to trace over the next 9 months is how do we understand sort of the legacy of these power relationships over the generations? We know that John Waters' grandmother, Jerusha Waters, was a servant in the household of another Thomas Hicks several generations later in what is now Douglaston Manor. This is right after the Revolutionary War. And this Thomas Hicks lived in high style, and he demanded to be called my lord by everyone in town and everyone in his household. Jerusha Waters, native person, regarded him as her lord. So how do these power relationships, this legacy, look at Zion? Because we know that the Hicks family, the Cornell family, were members of Zion, founding members. And we also know that the Waters and Davis families were also members at Zion in the 19th century. When I heard that, I thought to myself, I assumed the worst. I assume that Native peoples here at Zion would have been given second-class status. And that is not actually what we found. Hard to see here, but this is the record of the vestry election from 1850. And the two wardens elected are James Valentine and Charles Waters, John Waters' brother, who himself was also a native Algonquin speaker and a Matinecock Indian. I think that's pretty exciting. That in the midst of all this historic struggle between the descendants of white settlers and the descendants of indigenous people, that for 30 years, Charles Waters was a vestryman here at Zion. And for 20 of those years, he was warden, the most powerful layperson in the parish. I'm so curious to learn more about what else we can learn about these relationships and what happens when Charles Waters passes away and leaves the vestry in 1896. What happened in the next 20 or 30 years such that when the city wanted to desecrate the Waters family burial ground, that we have yet to find any record of Zion taking any stand on that. Maybe we will find out, and I would rejoice to find that. How do we understand this legacy of representation and what it means? I'm going to hand it back to Alexis to trace. Again, we're sort of thinking about John Waters as sort of a central node in all these different connections, things that we're trying to learn about way back in history and then very, very present.
So I just kind of like to think about what John Waters' life was like. And the thing that amazes me is that John and his wife, Elizabeth, who was also an indigenous person, had 13 children. I can't imagine 13 children. But some of their children are Maria, Oni, Hannah, Bertha, Solomon, Sylvia, Solomon II, John, Sidney, Jeffrey, and Isaac. And I just imagine those children. What? Yeah. Well, you know, just to think about what that experience was of Zion with that family, right? So John and Elizabeth were among those buried on the Northern Boulevard burial ground. So here's a picture of it before it was disturbed. You can see there's headstones, and we're not sure, but I'm pretty sure that this picture was taken in the context of the surveying, and you see the neighbors looking on as folks who look sort of official there are surveying the land. I think it's also worthy to note, interesting to note, that some of these bodies had already been moved because there was a burial ground on the location of where the now Douglaston Club was. Well, did you? This, you know, I don't have an exact year, but this is probably the late 20s. So this is probably like maybe as late as 1930. I'm saying late because we have another picture. This is 31. So this is actually sort of the opposite vantage point. It's the other end of the plot. But you see here, this is when they did the excavation. Now, I had seen this picture many, many times, and you know, it looked like Douglaston to me, you know, looking at the buildings and looking at the crowd. But in doing my research and finding other pictures, and I can't say with certainty, but I am pretty sure that this is Susan and Oni Waters talking what looks like maybe an official here in this picture. And just to step back and think about this for a minute. You know, your family has fought the government for your land. You've lost that battle. And now you're watching as the city desecrates the burial ground of your parents and your ancestors in a way that we know without equivocation that graves were looted, possessions taken. John and Elizabeth are among the lost souls whose remains were not transferred to the Zion burial ground. So we're pretty certain that their remains remain under the buildings of Northern Boulevard to this day.
I just want to go back to this picture for a second. I just noticed this for the first time. It's very hard to see, but this picture is dated.
Yes.
October 20th, 1931. So it'll be 90 years exactly next week. And in 2031, in a few years, we will celebrate the 200th anniversary of Zion's founding at the same time that 100 years have passed since this painful moment. So let me just put out a couple of big, broad questions that I'm hoping that this history project, and again, all of you are invited to participate in this, would attend to going forward. We're never going to be able to answer these definitively, but these are some of the big picture questions we're asking. How do we honor these indigenous connections as Zion? In what ways have indigenous culture and indigenous values influenced our community? How have these cultures that have been suppressed and violated and put into the corner, how are they a part of who we are even today? What obligations do we have to bear witness to this history and to share it with others? And how do we do that knowing that it's not just our story? That this story is obviously central to the identity of our Matinecock neighbors. And they have known its pain their whole lives, and many of us, myself included, are just learning it. So what do we need to ask our Matinecock neighbors? But also, how do we need to prepare to learn well from them? And what if this is our story to tell? Might there be ways and times in which we need to cede the floor to our Matinecock neighbors for them to tell their story as theirs? Right now, I would love to just open it up for a little bit of reflection for those of us who are gathered here. And again, if you're joining on Zoom, please type into the chat.
Carl, and before we move on to reflections, one of the things that I forgot to share that I think is really important, the two women, Susan and Oni, who you saw in the picture, they are the ones that commissioned the Matinecock Memorial. And I think that it's really, I mean, I was so happy to find the names of them, and there's a beautiful, if anyone's interested, I can share, New York Times article that talks about the installation of the memorial in the early 30s. But I think one of the things that this work has shown us is how complex some of these histories are, in that very painful inscription was actually an inscription that was commissioned by the Waters family. So how all those dynamics and tensions play out. So I just didn't want to move on without highlighting that little bit of history.
Thank you so much. So I have 4 questions for us, and I want to just go one at a time. Of course, there's there'll never be enough time to unpack everything that we want to today. But just start simple. For those gathered here today, what do you want to learn more about? What do you feel like we need to learn more about? And if you would, are there things that you're really excited to learn? Are there things that you feel afraid to maybe find out? Catherine.
So I had a couple of things I was thinking. I'm not sure if they can answer this question, but I'll just put them out there. One thing that I do know, of course, is that not only before we arrived here, they, the indigenous Indians were here, but they also were living in natural environment. Water, the woods, the species, they sustainably were stewards of the land. And I've heard little snippets of stories over the years. Maybe big rock, which is not where. And I would be really excited to learn much more about the environment.
Yeah.
Also because there's environmental implications for doing now exactly what we naturally.
Yeah. So I'm just going to repeat that so that folks on Zoom can hear. Catherine Beelan is asking about, saying that she was curious to learn more about indigenous practices around the natural environment and what present day environmental efforts might have to learn from native stewardship practices. It's amazing.
Much better way of saying that.
Well, you did the first draft and I got a chance to, we'll do Paul and then Lynn and then Kay.
I'd like to learn what burial ground is. Those people, sacred, great desecrations, beliefs. I'd like to learn about their spirituality. Since, placement.
Yeah. So Paul is asking about, wants to know more about what the burial ground meant to the Matinecock people, and also wanting to know more about Matinecock spirituality. Regan also wants to know about that. Great. I think Lynn.
This lady over here was going to say, even in the fires out west, they managed the land, they had control of the roads, they took care of the environment. We desperate need of caring for the environment, sorry, the environment,
Yeah.
And practices that they use, we could bring back, just. I mean, historical cultures, we denigrated their practices. We need to learn from them desperately.
Lynn also saying, wanting to learn about indigenous environmental practices. And I think also, like, I'm hearing some passion about having destroyed what now we are recognizing would have saved us all along. Yeah. Okay.
Well, I was very excited for the participation of local Native people on the vestry here. And I don't know when those 13 people, the children, were born, but why don't we know anything? I mean, maybe you could. What happened after that? Charles and whoever, what was the continued association of that family and other Matinecock people who had been actually part of time? What happened to them during the 1900s? How many of them are still left around here of the 13?
Right. Excellent. Yes, the wolf pack.
Yeah. You may be getting this, but I would love to learn what, if anything, the current Matinecock tribal members want as a relationship with Zion. You know, do we want to host events together? Do we want to be advocates for them? Do we want to just be a place where they can gather and meet, step back, or do they want nothing to do with us, you know? And they is a very broad term, and, you know, it's not necessarily, they may not all agree. But I'm very curious about that.
I'm sorry, folks on Zoom. I forgot to say that Kay's interested in what happened within the generations after Charles Waters. What happened to Matinecock members of Zion? And Eve is asking a question about living Matinecock tribal members. And what do they want from Zion? How can we serve their needs and desires, knowing that there may be a lot of there may be many different viewpoints about that from within the nation. Will, what were you going to say?
You might have mentioned this before, but do we know where the original burial was? Was it on or near Zion's property?
With
The original burial that was the burial ground that was moved?
so at some point, and again, I don't have a really good sense of the history. The site where the country club is, Douglas Manor Country Club,
Okay.
that was burial ground, and those remains were moved. And then they moved some of those remains to the plot on Northern Boulevard, which ran like kind of like, I don't know the exact bounds, but like where Little Neck Parkway and Douglas and Northern Boulevard meet, you know, pretty much down, you know, 5 or 6 blocks, I'd say. It was sort of a triangular plot. But we do have historical records of like the exact dimensions and widths of where that was.
Okay.
The bank on Northern Boulevard, is it a New York Community? Yeah, so New York Community Bank is located on that. And there was an old Ace Hardware store, I think it's a dialysis center or something now. That stretch of development was all part of the Waters land.
So were all the bodies removed from that, or were there some?
No, not all the bodies were removed.
So
Some,
there are some supposedly there.
yes, absolutely.
And the Waters, John and Elizabeth, are among those that we think are still now under the asphalt.
And there are some relatives looking back around.
So this is maybe a way of extending that first question. What do you want to celebrate in this history and our indigenous connections in the present? Kate mentioned wanting to celebrate the fact that Charles Waters was a warden for 20 years in the 1800s. What else gets you excited, feels like something to celebrate as part of Zion's own legacy? Regan.
I noticed in today's service, it seems to go more with using diverse religions, political religions in our service. One of our hymns today was taken from an Indian chant or ritual, and we sang Shalom Shalom, which I understand to be Jewish part of religion. Not to identify or label the religions, but how does the Episcopal Church share spiritual feelings with other denominations, I guess it's religions, and again, back to Paul's thing about what were the Matinecock spiritual beliefs, and how did they share those with the Episcopalians? Now, I guess Zion Church has been an Episcopalian church ever since day one. So the spiritual practices of the Matinecock must have sort of agreed with the Episcopal.
So Regan is saying that one thing that's exciting is that we have a legacy of, even just in our worship today, Zion weaves in spiritual traditions, practices from other traditions. We sang a hymn that was originally, the melody is of a Dakota chant. Our music director, Andrea, suggested that in light of Indigenous Peoples' Day tomorrow. We also sang Shalom, Shalom, honoring our Jewish siblings and our connections, historic connections with them. And this raises this question about how have interreligious encounters happened in the last 200 years or longer. Many people who are buried in Zion's churchyard who are Matinecocks claim both Matinecock spirituality and the Christian faith as essential parts of who they are. And that those are ancient ways in which they want to walk at the same time. How can we learn more about that? Barbara.
Flushing cemetery. I don't know how old it is.
Barbara's asking about would Indigenous people be buried in other local cemeteries? And that's a great setup for a conversation that we're going to get into next week. Christina Schoenfeld has been doing some research about that very question. And we've got some, stay tuned. We've got some provisional answers and a lot more questions. Yeah. Go ahead, Alan.
Question is the original landowners had set up a church too in this area. Their own workers and so forth. Did that transpire in Zion or what? That was before that. I forget the name of it. But they did have a church here in Dublin. And it was on their grounds. Where it was exactly that they had it, and before Zion. What's the background on that?
Sure. So Alan is asking about history of churches here in what's now Douglaston before Zion. And how did Zion come about? Was it just that some people wanted to worship with the Book of Common Prayer and didn't want to do what an existing church was doing? I think we have some information about that, but this is the first I'm hearing of a church that predates Zion. So I obviously have a lot more to learn, and I'd love to talk more with you about that. So I want to sort of move from the intellectual curiosities that we have from a head space into a little bit of a heart space here. And this is something we're going to be practicing for months and months and months. So it's okay if this feels a little awkward. But is anybody willing to say, hey, hearing about this part of it hurts me, or I'm not sure I want to look directly at that? Where are the pain points of this story for you? Lynn?
Of the cultural heritage of our indigenous people and removing children from the past so that they could be schooled the American way and language, culture stripped from.
The destruction of indigenous cultures through many means, including taking children from their parents to educate them at boarding schools where they were prevented from speaking their native languages and forcibly assimilated into white culture. Yes. Other pain points. Greta first.
I read today that
someone coming from another country. We still do it, America still seems to be, to go into another country, claim it, change everybody, everything. The people who were there for like so long, so many years. And she's like, no, that's what it is, you know, this is the way we should go, and that's it. I mean, you told them they came in from England or from, you know, the Dutch colonies, and took over land that was already occupied. They just disregarded that. Like I used the Georgia discussion, there was before America was one, you know? So all those people that were there living off the land, being actually very good to the land. And here we are today. Here we are today. They cut their hair, they couldn't wear ponytails, so they couldn't wear their own black clothing. Could you imagine someone coming in this day and age and telling us, sorry, you can't wear that.
Right.
And you're here, you should have a wear instead, you know?
Yeah.
Right, right. Right, insane.
Yeah, Greta lamenting this, the many different facets of power, both in the colonial period and in the present, of American colonial efforts to go into a place, change everything, and treat both that land and the cultures there as kind of disposable. Yeah. Eve, what were you going to say?
I mean, I was gonna say something similar, just that, this is only one very small specific part of a very widespread history and continuing to happen. You know, so, I'm myself am part Cherokee, which is a completely very different part of the nation, but very similar stories, right? So it just brings up that pain and just knowing that it's happened for so long, continuing to happen to the point that even as we talk about this, and there's so much to still unearth and reflect on and figure out, just knowing that it's one very small portion of mass genocide and lots of other, you know, long history of things.
Paul?
Guatemala, 6 years ago or something, 4 years ago, something like that. Here there was a site. Christians like killing the Indians, put up this church. Like Christian sanctuary. From tour. It was about life. Christians, indigenous, environmental property. And I just like bring it up to date. Somehow I'm rebelling this. Schools, like voting children, and run by Christian organizations. So I did that. You know, I was just so like that. You know, Christian people.
Right. So Eve was speaking to like one pain point is an awareness that this really local story, which is so painful, is just one fraction of a much larger pattern of domination and destruction. And Paul pointing to that legacy in Guatemala, and also pointing to the fact that the church was a big part of that. Big part of that domination and destruction of other cultures in pursuit of an idea of Christian mission, that it was God's will for these cultures to be destroyed and for all those people to become Christians like the white European settlers. Kay, were you going to say a pain point?
This is really an extension of what I asked before, but the history, as many of you know, about Little Neck, the entire area now known as Douglas was owned by Douglas, and there were only a few residents there. And Westmore in Little Neck and Douglas Manor began to be developed after 1906 or thereabouts. And I'm the same way that our current history and our future are going to be affected by the change in the sheer numbers of immigrants and others. I would like to know about the process in the early 1900s in which the existing population vis-a-vis the Matinecock involved a much smaller group of non-indigenous residents in these two communities. I'm just curious about how the development of these many additional families coming in here affected the relationship of the remaining Matinecock and Zion and other institutions which came from the 1800s.
Right. So Kay, I think is, for those on Zoom, Kay is asking about the history of development of Douglaston and Little Neck into the residential communities that we know them to be today. How did that development happen? Were there perhaps narratives of progress, like Alexis spoke about initially, that this is the way for this community to develop? This is the path forward. And who suffered? Who was pushed out, either legally or economically? Those are really important questions to ask, and especially focusing on that early 20th century moment with the construction of what's now Douglas Manor, because that's the same period in which we see Matinecock representation at Zion fall off, and 30 years later, the desecration of that burial ground. What happened in that time period? I'm fascinated by that as well.
If it did fall off,
Right. Catherine, I'm going to give you in a second here. I want to just lift up a comment from Tula here. It pains me that historically the traditions, lives, and contributions of the Native Americans have not been taught to children, including the local contributions and lives in Douglaston, Little Neck. And so much has been lost because of this. Yes. Catherine, please.
Actually, similar to what you were saying, kind of meaningful thinking about how so small and sacred objects became curiosities to others, stolen or collected. And I've heard that a number of the homes built in the neighborhood that we're referring to, being in line, that when they were being built around 1900, 1920s, lots of things were found as they were building, excavating the ground, and that those objects were, I have heard, taken to some museum somewhere in Queens. I'm sure you've heard about that. So that means that machines are sitting somewhere in the cabinet. And I even heard stories from people that grew up in the neighborhood. Hang out on the shoreline with the dock or whatnot, and things would just wash up, and they would collect Indian objects, collect them and have them bring them home. So, I would like to know more about what those things were.
Catherine is speaking to how painful it is to think that aspects of indigenous culture just became curiosities.
There's several books written about all of this background.
Yes.
The relatives who lived over here had written a book. Suspect that we probably have some information going back to the 30s in our Oh my God, someplace.
Yeah.
Not there.
Yeah,
If you
so.
want to look up her books, they're on Amazon.
So we're definitely drawing on some of those books that you mentioned, and I think we absolutely want to be more in touch, not only with Donna, but also other historians whose work intersects with ours. I want to just close with one last question here. Again, if we can sort of stay in this like heart space, feeling space, accessing our spiritual imagination, knowing that we're going to be talking about this and excavating this, our own feelings about this for months to come, just as a starting point here, what comes to mind? What comes up in your heart when you think about confession, reconciliation, and healing? Thoughts?
This goes, I think, to some of Catherine's points, and to Kate's question about why some of the Native Indigenous connections might have fallen away. For research, a lot of the Native American members of our community got their living through Little Neck clams and oysters and fishing off of Little Neck Bay. And by the 1920s, those waters were no longer fishable. So that in that period of time, what happened is the environment was fluid. And that, for me, thinking about what we can do today to move forward, that for me has a lot of resonance, like the idea of restoring the lands and trying to undo the damage to the environment that's been done.
Oh,
It was really important to hear from descendants of the Wisconsin. They regard as part of their history and stories and things that I think we can do. To read, their perspective.
thank you. Thank you. Yeah, we may need to confess to the descendants of people who have been harmed. But that may not be something that we can do in the abstract. What is it?
I'm wondering what it means to do better. Like once we confess, what to do differently. And are we willing, am I willing to do it?
Yeah, I think for a pain point, like, I think that's something I've thought a lot about, sort of being the subject of righteous anger in the Matinecock community, and how in today's gospel, Jesus said, "Give up all your possessions," right? And the kids are like, "Well, nobody here is doing that, right? Like no one here this week, I don't think, has sold their home and give up all their possessions to walk away from Jesus." In that, it's very easy to say we want to reconcile. It's very easy to say we want feedback from the Indigenous community, but then when we get the feedback and it's stuff that makes us uncomfortable or stuff that we determine we can't do or won't do or don't want to do, like I'm very scared to open up that conversation and see the way those contours actually play out when the demands are put on us. Like it's really easy in that hypothetical situation to be like, yeah, we want to do better, we want to make it right, and then to go to the tribe and say, well, this is how you make it right, and be like, well, we're not going to do that. I think that's something that I really worry about.
I think it's fundamental right now, politics and much over. Not going to do that. Some are for, some are against. Change that. Funny that, right?
And I wonder, and one of my hopes, right.
How do you change beliefs? Or can you?
Well, one of my hopes for this project is that, and the reason it's so important for us to do it in community, to do it as a Zion parish family, is because I think that, you know, the core of the gospel is about transformation. And what does it mean for us to take that seriously together? Which doesn't mean necessarily that a year from now, we're going to be able to point to the fact that we've made huge gains, or, you know, everything is peachy keen now. But what does it mean for us to take this on as our task, our work, our invitation from the Holy Spirit, and guided and sustained by the Holy Spirit as we try to do that together?
Maybe we also need some input from a community that would like to help. You know, that's it. See how they feel we can help them instead of just going patients forward how we feel.
Exactly. Yeah. Going back to what Paul said about this needs confession, reconciliation, healing can't be something that we do apart from the people that we've always been in relationship with. Any concluding thoughts?
Yeah, it's a huge first step to just bring it up and start talking about it, and to work through communicating the need for it among ourselves and with others around us. That's a big first step, right? Positive. Praise to you and Alexis for, you know, bringing it up, exposing it, inviting everyone to come up.
I think the bell has rung to conclude our time here today. Thank you all for being here. Please come back next Sunday, where we're going to talk about this second parallel track about the presence and absence of Black Americans. I think we're going to discover some similar feelings, some similar opportunities. And again, all of you are invited to participate in this research, this processing. Please talk to me about that. Thank you, thank you, thank you.